Hey there, Billy King is back again with the Quick and Dirty Theology Show. Today I want to tackle the question of divinity. Now there's a lot of different perspectives on divinity in the world, and it's always important to keep in mind that when you say God to someone, they may have a different idea in mind altogether of what that means than what you mean. This is key. Because if you say to somebody who believes in the Greek pantheon, which most of the people who wrote the New Testament had to deal with, they're going to have a very different conception of who God is than the people who have a Jewish background. So we have these cultural conflicts throughout all of human history dealing with who God is. And any time Christianity comes into a different culture, and a different set of perspectives, they're going to have to wrestle with the question of God in a different way. So the way that God is explained is used in different language, different terminology, different categories, different worldviews, different cosmologies, but they all point to something that's encountered that's beyond those categories, paradigms, and worldviews. Even in the Bible, you would sometimes have people who were writing their texts with different assumptions about God than other people. The Bible was written over centuries and centuries. We have oral traditions from thousands of years before that are impacting the conceptions of God. We also have people from the time of the Roman Empire writing and contributing to the Bible with their own perspectives on God. And so when somebody in the Old Testament talks about God, they might have an idea that there is one God. But for some people, they might not have that idea. Some people might believe that God is actually up high, where other people believe that God exists in a different spiritual plane. These assumptions about God are brought into the way that they speak about God, so that God is never quite clearly defined in the Bible. God is not quite clearly defined by anyone, because we're talking about God. And if you're going to talk about God, clarity in definitions is rarely a privilege that you will be able to exercise. In fact, the Christian tradition has generally spoken about God in one of two ways. They will either talk about what God is not, or they'll speak about God in ways that create a tension. So, when you speak about what God is not, you will say, well, God is not bound by time. God is not bound by space. God is not immortal. God is not contained within the universe. But what God is, since it's not these things, is hard to grasp. Because in many of those instances, those things are beyond anything we've ever experienced, or any context in which we could somehow come up with a perspective. The other way to look at God is through tensions. Now, this is similar to the way that we compose music, or we write a poem. If we write a poem, we're dealing with words that have meaning, but in the tension created between those meanings, those terms, in the sort of the paradoxical connection between the words and that space that's not defined is actually where the beauty of the poetry is. The same thing is true with the music. A note by itself is not as beautiful as a string of notes that are expressed in tension with one another. So this is how God is defined as well. We often will say two things or three things about God which don't completely resolve. And in that unresolved tension, the beauty of who God is often shines clearest. This is actually embodied in one of the ways that Hebrews write. Hebrew poetry is characterized by this idea of parallelism. Basically, if something's Hebraic poetry, there will be two things which are in relationship with one another, and in that relationship, the true poetry is expressed. So this is a great way of talking about God. You say two things about God that don't seem to completely reconcile, but in that tension, the beauty of who God is, which is beyond words, beyond terminology, beyond definitions, shines through. So if you're a Hebrew person writing the Old Testament, you may have a conception of God as someone who is just. That might be one of the guiding characteristics of divinity in your mind. But along with that, there's this concept of chesed, which is introduced. This idea that God pursues people in love and mercy, no matter what. Now, on the other hand, if you're a Greek, your perspective on God might be rooted in the idea that God is actually, in his very nature, divine simplicity. The main idea for you when you think about God is that he is this thing that is being beyond being. And so God is actually intangible in your import of what divinity means. But when Christians got a hold of this concept, what they said is, yes, we believe that God is one. We believe that there's a sense that God is the ultimate divine simplicity. But at the same time, we're going to affirm that God's a community of three hypostases in unity with one another. God is one, but he's also three. They created a tension, a paradox, that both embraces and confronts the ideas of divinity at their time. The challenge for Christians today is to recognize and locate one's own self in what do you think of when you think of God. And to not just import what your culture, what your community, what your philosophical framework intends for you to import, but to take that, evaluate it, and see, is there a way in which God can be presented that challenges that, but not by negating it, but by expanding it, by creating a dialectic of beauty from which the true nature of God might be somehow encountered. This is the way that Christianity does theology. It says what God is not, and it speaks of what God is in paradox. And somewhere in there, there is the hope that you will somehow encounter who God really is for yourself. Because ultimately, the one thing that Christianity says about God is that God is someone who loves, and love is done in relationship. God invites us into that relationship, and that's what it means to know God.